Before a concrete foundation is ever laid, before a frame is ever built or any single brick is ever put down, there is a step in the construction process that is perhaps more crucial than any other step, at least to begin with. And there was a team of builders in Shanghai, China, who a number of years ago found this out the hard way. This is a picture of the Lotus Riverside apartment building. A 13-story apartment building toppled over on its side in 10 seconds. Now, it wasn't the concrete foundation that crumbled. It wasn't anything to do with the design of the actual structure that caused it to fall. But nonetheless, it just kind of went and fell over on its side. Barely any damage done to the structure itself. And it's all because they missed one critical step. And the fall of the building wasn't even the worst part. There was fallout that ensued afterwards. In fact, there was a construction worker that arrived early to work that day to gather some of his tools, and he was in the building when it fell over and lost his life. Millions of dollars of lawsuits came out of this building falling over. Contractors lost their licenses. Tenants lost their future homes that they were planning. There were even lifelong prison sentences handed down because of this building falling over, all because one critical step was missed in the building process. What step was missed? They did not think about the importance of digging. It was the digging. They didn't dig down deep enough to have a firm foundation in the soil that the building could stand on. In fact, if you look at the top right picture there, I found out after first service, those beams sticking out are called piers. I did not know that. Somebody came up and told me that. They just kind of almost like a flagpole in the ground, just kind of like came up out of the ground because they didn't dig down deep enough in the soft clay. And when rain came and pressure happened, the building fell over because they neglected the digging. Do you have any relationships in your life that remind you of this toppled over building? Maybe right now you're living in the fallout of a broken family dynamic or a fractured marriage, workplace tension, or friendships marked by the silent treatment, all because we haven't learned how to dig before we try to build. I want to ask you here this morning, what is the soil underneath the surface of your heart like? Like if you were to dig down and you were to excavate the soil of your own heart, what is that soil like? What emotions are living underneath the surface of your heart? What fear might be down there if you took an honest look that has just become such a constant humming buzz that you don't even realize it's there anymore? What kind of wounds live down there that have never been processed or healed? Is there a chance that maybe there's emotion living in the deep parts of your heart, but you've buried it down so deep that you're convinced there's not even emotion there? See, here's the truth for this morning. We're going to, in this series, brick by brick, over the next several weeks, we're going to give you tools, bricks, if you will, to build. But here's what's true. You cannot build strong until you dig deep. The very first tool that we need in building healthy, strong, sustainable relationships in our lives is a shovel to dig with. Now, some of you might be thinking to yourself, like, really, man, we're going to talk about emotions to start with? Like, this world is too full of emotions as it is. Maybe you grew up in a home where you were told to kind of stuff your emotions under the rug and never bring them up or deal with them. Maybe you've been taught to believe that showing emotion is a form of weakness. Maybe you think to yourself, man, these younger generations are just way too emotional. The last thing we need in the world is more emotion. And I agree with you. I don't disagree with you in that. There are way too many people in the world right now who are being ruled by their emotions. But I would argue on the flip side, there are way too few people who are aware enough and have processed the deepest emotions of their soul, and that is different. See, unprocessed emotions don't disappear, they just get buried alive. And they come up in our reactionariness, in our reactions, and our defensiveness, all over the place. Our unprocessed emotions come up. There's an author named Pete Scazzaro who wrote a whole resource and curriculum called Emotionally Healthy Spirituality, Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. And he says this about emotional processing and emotional health. He says, emotional health and spiritual maturity are inseparable. It is not possible to be spiritually mature while remaining emotionally immature. In other words, you cannot build strong until you dig deep. And that is true even in our relationship with the Lord. That building strong is really hard if we've never learned how to first dig deep. And so today we're going to look at someone from the Bible. His name is David, and David is one of the most compelling characters in the biblical narrative. He is someone who is super well known in the Old Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures, but his story basically is a meteoric rise from the runt shepherd of his family that nobody saw or paid attention to, and he rises up and becomes one of the most prolific, effective kings of the nation of Israel. He is the second king of Israel right after Saul, who we talked about a couple weeks ago. And so David is a king whose kingship is marked by military conquests and victories. David slayed his tens of thousands, the scriptures say. He is a political master in the way that he led as king. But his life is also marked by tremendous instances of sin and failure, especially when it comes to his own family and his own relationships. King David is someone who experienced the highest of highs and the lowest of lows. He knows the mountain and the valley both and everything in between. And after all of that, he is called a man after God's own heart. How can this be? Well, I want to take a look at David today. And there is perhaps no more complex, complicated, layered relationship that he had on the planet than the relationship that he had with his son, Absalom. Now, David had a lot of kids. Holy cow, he had a lot of kids. We have, of his sons, he has at least 19 that are named, multiple daughters on top of that, and probably more sons than even what the scripture mentions by name. We'll just suffice it to say David had 19 kids and counting, okay? Hey, that got a little laugh. Nobody in first service laughed at that. I thought it was a pretty good joke. Anyways, he has at least 19 kids. We know that. And there is a moment in David's story where his kids get into a pretty profound conflict with one another. 3 of his kids are involved in this. And I just want to give you a trigger warning. Like, this story is marked by some of the most broken dynamics of human relationships that can possibly exist. And I'm not going to go in super great detail into what happens here, but suffice it to say, one of David's sons, named Amnon, does something pretty horrific to one of David's daughters, his sister, named Tamar. He violates her in a very profound and damaging and sinful way. And Absalom, like any of us, sees what happens to his sister, and he is infuriated towards his brother over what he did to their sister. Take a look with me in 2 Samuel 13, starting in verse 22, at how Absalom responds to Amnon, who just did this to their sister. But Absalom spoke, verse 22, to Amnon, neither good nor bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister Tamar. So you can even see right here that Absalom is plotting. Wheels are turning on how to get revenge on his brother for the horrible thing that he did to their sister. And so in verse 28, reading on, it says, then Absalom commanded his servants, mark when Amnon's heart is merry with wine. It's just the Bible's way of saying, wait till Amnon's a little tipsy. And when I say to you, strike Amnon, then kill him, do not fear, have I not commanded you? Be courageous and be valiant. So the servants of Absalom did to Amnon as Absalom had commanded. Then all the king's sons arose, and each mounted his mule and fled. So Absalom has his brother killed. And word of this gets to their father, David, who is king at the time. And what is David's response in this moment? He is utterly undone. The Bible says that he fell on his face in grief, and he grieved day after day after day. Can you imagine the layers to David's grief in this moment? Not only is he grieving the loss of his son Amnon, but at the same time, he's probably incredibly angry at Amnon for what he did to his daughter Tamar. And not only that, but he's also probably grieving what happened to his daughter Tamar, like any father would. And then on top of that, he's incredibly angry towards his son Absalom for the way he took revenge against his other son Amnon. I mean, the layers of grief and complexity of human motion, even in this story here, is profound and it is layered. And I don't know what your relationship has looked like with the Bible, but I think no matter how you approach the Bible, at the very least, you can say that the Bible is really, really honest about the human experience. It doesn't shy away from the ugliness of it. And so how does David respond to his son Absalom killing his brother? Well, he gives him the silent treatment. In fact, you read about it here in the next chapter, chapter 14, verse 24. It says, and the king said, let him dwell apart in his own house. He's talking about his son Absalom. Let him dwell apart in his own house. He is not to come into my presence. So Absalom lived apart in his own house and did not come into the king's presence. We're going to jump down to verse 28 because the next few verses just basically talk about how Absalom is like the stud of the family. He's handsome from his toes to his crown of his head, and he's got these long flowing locks of hair that he only cuts once a year. It's a weird description, but anyways. So jumping down to verse 28. So Absalom lived 2 full years in Jerusalem without coming into the king's presence. So for 2 years, Absalom is separated from his father. And in this time, there is a root of bitterness that starts to grow in Absalom's heart towards his dad. For casting him out, for the silent treatment, for the distance, for 2 whole years of just not saying a word to him. And the silence is deafening in Absalom's heart and is starting to erupt and it is starting to grow. And here you see in the person of King David someone who is just coping with his own pain. And many of us, we know what this feels like. That instead of digging deep into the stuff of our own heart, we would much rather just build walls between us and other people. They hurt me and I will never get hurt in a relationship again. And so we build walls. I know what that's like. I've built walls in my life. For others of us, maybe it's not walls, but maybe the way that we avoid the digging work is we just try to people please. Like if nobody's ever mad at me, if nobody's ever disappointed in me, then I can be okay. So the way that we cope and avoid the digging work and processing of our emotions is we just try to please people and make everybody happy, and we are exhausted in the process. And yet there's others of us, maybe the way that we cope with dealing with our own stuff and our own junk under the surface is we pass the blame. Like if I'm never responsible for anything and it's always their fault, it's my parents' fault, or it's my spouse's fault, or it's my boss's fault, if it's always someone else's fault, then I never actually have to look inward at myself and process what's there. And if I'm honest, I'm a little scared to process what's there because it's not the prettiest thing to look at. See, as David copes and gives Absalom the silent treatment for 2 years, this bitterness that starts to grow in Absalom's heart starts to impact a whole lot of other people. And what Absalom starts to do is he actually starts to gather friends and starts to say basically, hey, you see the king, he doesn't care about your problems, he's too busy for you. And so Absalom starts being the shoulder people can cry on and the person people can come to when they have issues because the king is too busy for them. And he does this for a number of years until he starts to develop this following of people, and this bitterness continues to grow, and it takes root, and it keeps going deeper and deeper until finally Absalom has enough people on his team, on his side, that he's able to lead a full-out revolt against his father, King David. And a civil war erupts in Israel. An unprocessed emotion becomes a civil war just a few years later. This is a profound, profound story. And David ends up having to leave Jerusalem, and it says he's weeping as he leaves Jerusalem. And there's some glimpses that we get into his heart in this season that are just so incredibly powerful. And as we go into those places, I just want to ask you the question here this morning. How do you process emotions when you either feel like you're run by your emotions, you're ruled by them, or you feel like they're stuffed down and never processed in the first place? Because I believe there's two groups of people in here when it comes to emotions. There's those who have stuffed them down and who have refused to feel what's underneath the surface. And then there's others who are ruled by their emotions. Their emotions drive everything. They call all the shots in your life. And neither of these are spiritually healthy places to be or spiritually mature places to be. So I want to start by talking to the people who maybe are afraid to feel, or have been told for so many years that to feel emotions or to process them is some sort of weakness. And so for those who struggle to feel, one of the most important principles and practices that you can have in your life is learning how to speak from your emotions to God. What's so cool about David and the way his story is told in Scripture is you not only have his story told to us in 1st and 2nd Samuel, but overlaid on top of that is you have David's actual prayer journal in the Psalms, where you don't have to wonder what he's thinking as he's walking through and navigating this betrayal from his son Absalom. David's this incredible picture in this season of someone who is processing his emotions. He's speaking from his emotions to the Lord. Take a look at a few of the Psalms that David wrote during this season where he is wrestling with the betrayal of his son and the betrayal of his people. He says this in Psalm 3, verses 1 and 2, "O Lord, how many are my foes? Many are rising against me. Many are saying of my soul, there is no salvation for him in God." So he's bringing before the Lord false accusations made against him. You hear the emotion in his words? Next one here in just a couple verses later, verses 5 and 6. "I lay down and slept. I woke again, for the Lord sustained me. I will not be afraid of many thousands of people who have set themselves against me all around." He's being honest. He's not hiding away how he feels. He's bringing his fear to the Lord. Next one here, 41 verse 9. "Even my close friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted his heel against me." Processing betrayal and the pain that comes with that. And then the last one here, verses 55 through 12 through 19. "For it is not an enemy who taunts me, then I could bear it. It is not an adversary who deals insolent with me, then I could hide from him. But it is you, a man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend, my son Absalom," he's talking about there. "We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house, and we walked in the throng." This is a father who is deeply grieved, and he is bringing his emotions before the Lord in vulnerable and transparent honesty. David, yes, is a warrior, but he is a warrior who is not afraid to weep. He's not afraid to be honest before the Lord. And some of you are, maybe you're sitting here thinking to yourself, but why does this matter? Why does it matter that I'm honest with my emotions before the Lord? Here's why it matters. Because if you never learn how to feel grief in your life, you'll never learn how to grieve your own sin. And if you've never felt or been honest about the anxiety or the fear that you're experiencing under the surface, you never have the opportunity to cast that anxiety on him because he cares for you. There's a level of care that we experience from the Lord from being able to cast what's in us onto him so that he can carry it on our behalf. If you're not honest before the Lord about the disappointment that you feel, the letdown, it's really hard to have a real, honest, authentic hope in who he is. Same thing for positive emotions too. Like if you suppress your joy because you're worried about what other people might think and you diminish your joy, how can you ever actually trace your joy back to the source of it if you're never allowing yourself to feel it? And so I want to ask you here this morning, like just what it would look like for you to take one unprocessed emotion before the Lord this week. What are you angry about right now? What are you sad about? What is bringing you joy right now in this season that you are just elated about? Bring those unprocessed emotions before the Lord. He wants to hear them. So that's the first group of people, those who maybe struggle to feel emotion. Learn to speak from your emotions to God. But then I want to speak to the second group of us, and it's those who are ruled by their emotions. One of the most important practices that we can learn for our life, for those of us who find ourselves ruled by our emotions, is to learn to speak for our emotions, not just speak from our emotions. We have a whole lot of people, just go on social media for 2.5 seconds. We have enough people in the world speaking from their emotions all the time. We actually need to learn how to speak for our emotions, to get curious about why those things are living under the surface, to be able to look at them from an independent observer standpoint and say, why did I react this way in this moment? Why did that bruise me the way it did? Like to actually look at it from a distance. We try this with our kids every single day around our dinner table. We have 3 kids, my wife and I. We have a 9-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And yes, they are 6, 7. They say that all the time. Some of you are like, what the heck did he just say? And all the parents of kids are like, oh my gosh, it's so annoying. Anyways, they remind us all the time. They are 6, 7 years old. And so we do this thing around our dinner table where it's a game we call that's called Rose, Thorn, Spaghetti. And basically how it goes is Rose is what was the best part of your day? What made you glad today? Thorn is what was the worst part of your day? Like what made you mad or sad today? And spaghetti is just what made you laugh today? Like what was the funniest, silliest, most joyful part of your day? And it's so fascinating to watch them go through this process. The other day, my 7-year-old, I had gotten home a little bit late, and she goes, my Rose is that I love my daddy so much. Aw, yeah, that's an appropriate response. I thought the same thing, aw. And then she goes, my thorn is that daddy got home late tonight. It's like, aw. And then her spaghetti is daddy still thinks he's the boss of me. So the reason that we go through this with our kids is because we actually, in some small way, we want to teach them how to not just feel their emotions and their big feelings as they're feeling it, but to actually get curious about like, well, why did that make you so happy today? Or why did that hurt you? And there's something powerful that happens when we're not just speaking from our emotions, but we're learning to speak for our emotions. And you see the psalmist do this. So not only does David speak from his emotions before the Lord when he's in pain, but he also speaks for his emotions as almost an independent observer getting curious about why they are there. Take a look at what he says in Psalm 42, verse 11. A lot of scholars believe this was also written during the season where Absalom was revolting against him. He says this, why are you cast down, O my soul, and why are you in turmoil within me? Hope in God, for I shall again praise him, my salvation and my God. You know, could it be that the emotions that you are feeling are trying to tell you something? That anger that you feel is telling you that a boundary has been violated in your life? That anxiety that you feel, could that be telling you that maybe your schedule or where you're placing your hope is in the wrong place? I mean, God can use our emotions to speak to us. And the truth is, our emotions cannot be in the driver's seat of our lives. They can choose the radio station every once in a while, but they do not get to drive. And the healthiest, most spiritually mature people are those who know how to honestly bring their emotions before the Lord and who also know how to honestly talk about their emotions and process them in real time. And so as we take a look at David and Absalom's story, it comes to a rather abrupt ending here. If you track along with the war that's been ensuing and the civil war that's kind of broken out, you see this instance where Absalom is riding along on his horse, on his steed, and just picture like his long, beautiful, flowing locks behind him, like Prince Charming or something like that. And so he's riding along, and this is true, you can read about this in 2 Samuel. All of a sudden, those long, beautiful locks of hair, they get caught in an oak tree, and the horse keeps going, but Absalom stays put because his hair catches him in an oak tree. And there he is just hanging there like a human piñata. And David's commander, Joab, comes and takes that human piñata a little bit too literally and puts an abrupt end to David's son Absalom. And of course, all of David's armies are like, we won! Like they're overjoyed. Like this is good news. We have to tell the king we have good news to share with you. Your enemy is dead. Their armies have been defeated. And so they come to him, and I want you to take a look at how David responds in this moment. Every single time I read this passage, these couple verses from 2 Samuel 18 and 19, it sends chills up and down my spine. Like it touches something in me so deep, and even in studying for this sermon, I think I figured out why it touches me so deeply. And so 2 Samuel chapter 18, starting in verse 32, the king said to the Cushite, so this is the guy who brought him the news, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the Cushite answered, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. In other words, he's telling the king, Absalom has met his abrupt demise. And then take a look at David's response. And the king was deeply moved and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. And as he wept, he said, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would I have died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son? Going down to verse 4, the king covered his face, and the king cried with a loud voice, oh, my son, Absalom, oh, Absalom, my son, my son. 5 times, David says this line, Absalom, my son, my son. And all of the people around him who are overjoyed at the defeat of David's enemy are like, why? What is he doing? You see, in this moment, David is caught between 2 identities. On one hand, he is a king, and his job is to exude strength and resolve. His job is to show up. His job is to lead strategically. He has a job over here. And for a king in the Middle Eastern culture that David is a part of, to show any kind of emotion would have been called weakness. But then over here, David is a father. And he is a father who is hurting and grieving and conflicted and torn over the life of not just his son, but also over the life of his betrayer. Take a look at this. I think this is why this hits me so significantly, these words of David. You have a king on one hand, and he is conflicted between his role as a king and his grief over his betrayer. King grieving his betrayer. King grieving his betrayer. I think the reason that his reaction is so powerful is because it points us directly to another king who finds himself in the midst of betrayal. See, on the night that Jesus was betrayed, he washed his disciples' feet. He washed the feet of people who would deny even knowing him. On the night that he was betrayed, he broke bread and gave it to his disciples to eat, saying, "This is my body, which is broken for you, and this is my blood, which is shed for you." On that same night, just a couple hours later, he found himself in a garden, sweating drops of blood from his forehead, grieving over the lostness of the world, digging deep into the emotion of it all. In his final week, we see Luke describe Jesus weeping over the lostness of Jerusalem, a king grieving over those who would betray him. Jesus, my friends, is the true and better David. And what Jesus does is he allows his grief, the places where he digs deep, to lead him to a cross where he would lay his life down for the redemption of all of humanity, for everyone who would give their lives to him and confess him as Lord. Here's what I'm absolutely convinced of: that when we are willing to let God dig deep into our souls, when we are willing to excavate, when we are willing to go to the place that we do not want to go, he never, ever, ever exploits us in shame. When we bring that stuff to him, the cross is proof that that is the very soil that he rebuilds a new life on. And this has been so true for my own life. A number of years ago, my wife and I were in Wisconsin at a retreat with a group of other pastors. And there were probably about 14 of us in the room. And one of the nights of the retreat, the pastors brought in a couple other people that were going to do a time of prophetic prayer over us. And so these people that were brought in to pray, they did not know us. They did not know our stories. They did not know anything about us. They didn't even know our names. And they come in, and one by one, they pray very specific, very pointed prayers over each person sitting in that circle in that room. And so for some of the people sitting there, they prayed over their ministries and the churches that they were a part of. For other people sitting in that circle, they prayed over their parenting or whatever, finances or whatever it might be. I mean, they had very, very specific prayers over each person that they did not know. And then they got to us. And they specifically began talking about my wife's and I's marriage. And they began talking about the cracks that were in the foundation of our marriage that we didn't even know existed at that point. They began talking about the ways in which my wife felt like second or third behind the ministry I was called to here at New Life. They started talking about the resentment, and then they said something before they prayed that I will never, ever forget. They said, "A tornado will come against this house, and it will level the foundation to the ground. But brick by brick, we will rebuild a broken life." And what we didn't know at the time is that a year after that retreat, our life would be leveled. That we would have to step away from ministry for a season to heal what was so fractured and what was so broken in our marriage and in our life. And it was hard work. I do not want to suggest to anyone that relationships that are healthy are not hard work. They are the constant process of excavating and digging into our own heart. My wife and I, we are still doing the digging work. The digging work does not stop. The only time the digging work stops is on the other side of eternity when we are fully made new in Jesus and our bodies are glorified and we're with him for all of eternity, forever and ever, amen. But right now the digging work continues. And what I saw God do is, as my wife and I just scoop by scoop, shovelful by shovelful of digging the resentment and digging the bitterness and the unforgiveness and digging up the misplaced priorities and digging up the lust and digging up the shame and digging up the greed and digging up the lies and deception and digging up all of it. What we saw is a foundation that God could build on. And he has. And he's continuing to do that work. And I think what makes David, for all of his failures and all of his shortcomings, and all of his just brokenness and sin and just junk in his life, I think what makes him a man after God's own heart is that he never stopped letting God excavate his own soul. He never stopped digging. When confronted with his own sin, he didn't try to make excuses. He didn't try to hide it or, shovel over it or put fig leaves on it. He just said, no, this is who I am. I am broken. I am a sinner in need of rescue. I need you, God. Let these bones you have broken rejoice, he says to God in one point at one of the lowest points in his life. So I ask you here this morning, can the same be said of us? Are we willing to dig so that God can build? Not is your spouse willing to dig, not is your boss willing to dig, not is your brother or sister or the person that you have bitterness towards willing to, are you willing to do the digging work in your own heart that God will build on? We're gonna close our service this morning with communion, because it was the night that he was betrayed that King Jesus broke the bread and offered the wine to his disciples, saying, this is my body broken for you, and this is my blood shed for you. But when we come to this table, there is something that the scriptures calls us to each do individually as we come to this place and this table. The Apostle Paul says it so well in 1 Corinthians 11:28. He says this, he says, examine yourself. Examine yourself before eating the bread and drinking the cup. In the words of Psalm 139, verse 23, test me and know me, God. Test my anxious thoughts. Search me and know me, God. Test my anxious thoughts. So as we come to the table this morning here today, we're just gonna leave a few minutes of space for you to do just that work, to examine your own heart, to allow the Holy Spirit to excavate what you are keeping hidden under the surface and under the soil. Trusting that in the weeks to come, he's gonna build something stronger and healthier and better than what we can build on our own. And so as we close here this morning, I just wanna ask you once again, what are you angry about this morning? What sin is living under the surface this morning that he wants to dig up, that you need to bring before him? What are you celebrating right now? What are you hopeful for? Where are you joyful? Where are you afraid? Bring those things before the Lord and ask him to heal and rebuild and restore. Love you guys.